All right. So it's time to start. So the final event of this year's CAU Cinema and Media Studies Colloquium. Today we are very happy to bring Dr. Jussi Parikka to today's event. So let me briefly introduce his work, although it's actually tough to sketch what he has been doing down to a limited number of works. So Dr. Parikka is currently a professor in digital aesthetics and culture at Aarhus University in Denmark, as professor in technological culture and aesthetics at the Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton. The audiences, you are already familiar with his work, are very aware of how prolific he has been. So let me introduce his major books and edited corrections in my introduction. So his books include Digital Contagions, Insect Media, and What is Media Archaeology, all of which made great contribution to establishing media archaeology as a key methodology for interdisciplinary media studies in the 21st century. And in a geology media published by University of Minnesota Press in 2015, he expanded that kind of methodology into the questions of into redefining and expanding what media is and how it works in the context of Anthropocene and new materialism. And other books include Through Contemporary Violence, Damages the Environment of Technological Culture, published by Stumble Press, and Digital Contagions or Media Archaeology of Computer Viruses, second edition in 2016. As the latest single author's book, Operational Images from the Visual to the Invisual, also published by University of Minnesota Press, which is a topic of today's talk. He also has been prolific in terms of collaborating with other scholars and artists. So the rep book, Situated Practices in Media Studies, was co-authored with Darren Wertherer and Rory Emerson, and he also co-edited a bunch of the anthologies, including Photography of the Scale, co-edited with Thomas Dvorak, published by Edinburgh University Press, and in 2011, Media Natures, Materiality of Information, Technology, and Electronic Waste. And in the same year, Media Archaeology Approaches, Applications, and Implications, co-edited with Erkki Kutamo. And yeah, so also there are, the journal special issue editions and the numerous articles in report journals and the curator jobs and other, other works that integrate, the creativity and research. So today, I'm very excited about today's event where Dr. Parikka will introduce provides an overview of his operational image, which is also connected with his upcoming book co-authored with Abelardo Gil-Fournier, which is entitled Living Surfaces, Images, Plants, and Environmental Media, that will be published by the MIT Press in June 2024. So please welcome Dr. Jussi Parikka.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be part of the seminar. I really, as I mentioned to you just a moment ago as well, it's been such a Great lineup for a longer time as well, and so it's really a privilege to be part of it with the talk that I'm very grateful that is has been translated into Korean as well. So a big thank you to the translator. And as mentioned, it deals with the recent book, Operational Images, as well as moves to introduce some themes that relate to that Living Surfaces book, which all of it comes down to the point of my probably past 10 years or so. I've been mostly interested in questions of environmental media and eco media, but also in this case, especially with this particular concept central to cinema and film and photography as such. So I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'll be available for a short Q&A afterwards as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So so we'll play his recorded talk video with Korean subtitles. So let's watch it and so engage the Q&A and discussion afterwards. 예, 이제 플레이해 주시면 됩니다.
All right. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be giving this talk, and I look forward to engaging with you in the Q&A. So first of all, obviously, a big thank you to organizing this and inviting me. So let me start by way of reference to the title of my talk. Around late 1960s and early 70s, asked the question, if there is life on Earth. Of course, paradoxical, considering it was asked by a group who themselves were an exhibit of life on Earth, including the famous Carl Sagan, involved in writing up these articles as part of the research and ending up as one of the key popular faces of astrobiology, including on television. That should have answered the question already. The question was, however, one of photographic and remote sensing resolution, and as such about a particular visual or sensorial epistemology of life. Do we perceive life with the sensorial tools at hand, and how do we investigate resolution as a threshold of perception for those proxies we consider to be about life? Actually, the question of life in this case was about questions of remote sensing for perception of proxies. At the back of the start of the satellite era, and these meteorological satellites such as, for example, TIROS and Nimbus, the new period of sensorial coverage of what Earth consists of reached new heights. The Cold War period of satellite coverage for military entertainment and science has been widely discussed, but it's still an intriguing to tap into this period as emergence of a specific kind of a sensorial question about the capacities of media technologies to detect what they are meant to detect. After all, these remote sensing satellites, such as TIROS or Nimbus and others, were in the middle of the 1960s investigated not only as to what they allow to see as instruments of imaging, continuing the legacy of instrumental images from World War II in the manner that Alan Sekula had analyzed, but also to investigate the instruments themselves, how valid, how applicable is the data we receive from these images, or even these unimages, these non-images that do not just fall into the usual category of a photograph, right? This was, after all, the emergence of things like imaging heat signatures and representing vegetal fields and surfaces and vegetal health through infrared imaging techniques. Carl Sagan and other scientists' question was peculiar. It also seemed to include a hat tip, of course, to David Bowie, who asked in 1971, "Is there life on Mars?" Bowie's song itself was perhaps a footnote to the Mariner 6 and 7 spacecrafts that had succeeded in these close flybys of Mars in 1969 as part of their reconnaissance mission investigation that went very close to the surface formations to see if there was, at least once, ages ago, life on Mars. Other Mariner missions followed, as did other songs about life on Mars and life on other planets. Sagan, then, the other people's question was about resolution. As a resolution of 1 kilometer visibility, they claimed no life on even Earth can be easily found. The map is the territory, and the view to a planet is for all the purposes of institutional understanding, all that one has. Small hints of best, some signs of technical civilization, such as highways, jet contrails, or orthogonal grids might be visible. If one takes those as proxies of life, then in this case equals architecture and technical modification of landscapes. This result was achieved after weeding through thousands of photographs, demonstrating 2 points where astrobiology turned into media science. That any question of ontology is premised on devices that establish the verification of that state of things. And in this particular historical period, a significant role is played by media technologies, such as photographic remote sensing. Several images from across the period of 60s and 70s from Sagan's texts. I've been fascinated by the operational nature of this project that spanned both sides of the Mariner expeditions of 1969. Already before, the team had investigated similar questions through ground truthing Earth. As we know, there is life on Earth, but could we detect it by way of the instruments that we're then sending to other planets as well? In the early 1970s, Sagan specified the question of detection by way of a diagram of thresholds of perception. Based on his sample of photographs, while the 1 kilometer resolution didn't easily depict any visible life that easily, only through a very large data set, one could see some details. The 100-meter resolution started yielding results of these thousands of images again, not just some single ones, but at least some dozens, started to show roads, canals, agricultural fields, and similar proxies that then had significant impact on the evaluation of the question at hand. For Sagan, this was the task of an imaginary Martian scientist who was trying to see what we are trying to see on Mars. They were trying to see if there was life on Earth. To observe what could be a proxy of life, what resolution would be relevant for the task at hand, and what is the relation of models of life and their empirical modes of observation, or the media technologies in this case as well. So while sharing my fascination with this case, it is underpinned by a relation to operational images. My recent book on this specific kind of a genre of images, even if I think the word genre itself is a bit mistaken, operational images in this case are those thousands and thousands and thousands of images that come to play a role in the institutional setting of detection, observation, and recursive imaging that feeds into the operational activities, and it feeds into these broader questions as well. And in this case, the logistical apparatus of Mars missions. These are images that are not really images necessarily of things in the photographic sense, even if in a way they are ways of detecting things. They are ways of collecting or showing and analyzing in series patterns, data patterns from image surfaces. It is already at this stage, historical stage, and in this case of particular institutional use, where datafication of images comes to play a role. And and it comes to feature centrally about an image that is not just a single image as an object of interest. It's a different kind of an imaging operation than the single Earth shots that we often see and that circulated widely since the 1960s and became the symbolic backdrop for environmental holistic consciousness. Let me talk a bit more about this insight and connection to operational images. While we keep the question of resolution or devices of resolution and operational images from remote sensing satellites to other technical and scientific missions at the back of our brains, because we'll return to that a bit later. I want to talk more about operational images before then moving on to a related project that deals with questions of sensing of surfaces of the planet as a problem of media and visual image studies. But first, operational images. So I released a book on this topic under the same title, borrowing the title from Harun Farocki, a title and a term that emerges from Farocki's video works and film works, while also expanding to past years of work that addresses questions of machine and computer vision, surveillance and visual detection, as well as the broader datafication of visual culture that many scholars have over the past years in really interesting ways addressed already. Here's some samples up on the screen, not a full list at all, far from it. Institutionally, the context of the project was funded. It was a project that was funded by the Czech Science Foundation. In this project, Operational Images and Visual Culture, that I've led from 2019 until just now, until 2033, it finishes now in December. Our team located at the renowned film and photography school, FAMU, at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague. The whole team of 5 people investigated the transformations of visual culture and photography through the lens of the concept of operational images. An earlier piece of research, as an example, was published as the book Photography of the Scale, that turned the notion of scale as a central device for looking into photography, not just photographic works or photographers of past years who have dealt with the question of this image flood and massive increase in images, something that Sean Cubitt in the book calls the mass image, and which also has an interesting relation to AI and datasets of photographs. But in addition, also this epistemic relevancy of the notion of scale that relates to measurement and measure, navigation, and alternative notions of the image and alternative notions of light that comes to stand as instruments, back to instrumental images. My own example in this book was about the particular pulse imaging instruments of LiDAR, LiDAR imaging as they are employed, for example, in autonomous driving, and I continue the topic also in the book, operational images as well. So in operational images, one of the key things that I try to do is investigate a bit about operational at the expense of images. So I try to do a bit more on what the notion of operationality is as a way of understanding images. Images become almost secondary to the question of operationality. This implies a couple of things. In what sort of operational chains are images involved in what sort of institutional operations, as devices, as epistemic instruments, as media technologies. In other words, where they perform a function such as investigation of the thresholds of perception or resolution for detection of life, or in how they are integrated into the pipeline of, for instance, development of AI computer vision models as training data. Operations comes to play a role in the historical sense as well. For example, operations research in the 20th century being one crystallization of the technological rationality and institutional strategies and tactics, and the context of not just the military thinking around operations research, but how it fed into a whole bundle of institutional themes, discourses, plans around managerial rationality in and since the Cold War. Operations also becomes a conceptual and a methodological cue of how to think the other part of the term, that is images. As such, I speak of them as images all the way to the bottom. Carl Sagan makes, again, a brief cameo appearance. This time it is him writing about the often mentioned parable of a turtle as the cosmological loop or infrastructure of the world. This is a long quote from Sagan's book, Broca's Brain, that basically outlines the idea of this cosmological view that it's basically turtles all the way down. I'll let you read it on the screen as well. It features, of course, in different versions. Sometimes it's assigned, the dialogue is assigned to Bertrand Russell, I think, and some other people as well. But instead of turtles, what if the history of photography, technical images, and visual media could be told in the same key? That it's about instruments built upon instruments, upon infrastructures, upon practices, upon techniques, upon further instruments and infrastructures, and so on, and so on, and so on. Operations are built on other operations that include elements that are material and semiotic. They are forms of knowing and forms of mattering. Closer to media theory, Geoffrey Winthrop Young points out that this kind of a turtle ontology is also shared by cultural techniques approach in media theory, involving actors concerned with operational sequences that involves actors, things, and practices that coming together give rise to established cultural practices. That it's at the back of this is this long trail of operational sequences. That is basically what culture is about. So could we say the same thing about operational sequences involving images? That there is a fundamental relational ontology at play, one that could be described by way of these scaffolding operations? Most likely the answer is yes, and it applies the other way around too, that images themselves are premised upon operational sequences and conditions that make images happen. That there's a lot of things that happen before images appear, and that they are reliant on a wide range of cultural techniques that bring about the image, and involves a really interesting relation to sensing as well, and the question of threshold where sensing turns into an image. Now, as you know, the notion of operational images referred to for Farocchi to these images that primarily operate, only secondarily do they represent. This doesn't dismiss the possibility that some representational practices, from landscape painting to contemporary cinema or historical cinema, could involve operational capacities, especially when we read it in the above sense of extended operations. Or even that representations or non-representations are operative stances in their own right as operational approaches to images. While Farocchi catered to us this wonderful video in his wonderful video works, the idea of navigational capacities of images, the often mentioned examples of cruise missiles, but also traffics and logistical observation of traffic, and other forms of circulation central to images as operating systems. The broader question of the operational and epistemic link extends even beyond this. So in the book, I try to elaborate this by way of the much discussed question of AI images, how the image in this sense escapes from the regime of visual to the regime of training sets, to the regime of models, and to the regime of platforms where AI and images are being employed and observed in different ways. As part of the legacy of measurement before and after photogrammetry in the 19th century, and as part of the questions of geopolitics and remote sensing, for example. Here I deal with the artistic work by the group GeoCinema, whose insights into the Chinese Digital Belt and Road Initiative tie the book as well into the question of environmental observation as part of geopolitical maneuvering and thus operational sensing of this sort. Now for the remainder of the talk, I want to focus on two things. I want to continue first on the notion of operations a bit more, as it features in the operational images. And then secondly, towards the end of the talk, I want to give sort of an insight, a snippet, a teaser trailer of another book where we, together with Abelardo Gil Fournier, have mobilized operational images into a question of planetary imaging, management, and image surfaces that come to feature as central role to understand environmental surfaces. And here really I develop much more in detail some of those questions of eco-media, but more on that in a moment. So briefly first, still with operations and operationality. So how would a theme familiar to image, cinema, and art studies look like if we expand it to operations? There is a distinct history of operations, as I hinted already, as it concerns the mathematical basis of computing and computational culture. For instance, Warren Sack points to the notion of operations upon numbers, such as arithmetic, but many others as well, from Leibniz to Ada Lovelace. And thus the mechanical operations that are designed into things we start gradually calling computers. Many other instances from history of science and engineering could be mentioned, and many of them refer to instances also of not just counting, but counting sort of, measurement and or mathematics, where we could claim have also become generalized beyond mathematics as a specific discipline into algorithmic procedures operating upon the world. Operations also hints at the legacy, as mentioned, of operations research, but I won't go into that too much in this talk, really. Happy to talk about it in the Q&A, for instance. Now, in humanities and media theory of past years, operations are plenty as well, and at least conceptually, and pointing to these helps to qualify a bit more the operational part in my book and in my thinking, as it concerns a specific kind of a power of operations upon and how operations work upon contemporary mediatized cultural and environmental landscapes. Operations comes to feature much outside images, or images become extended as operations upon the world. You can see the recursive bit again. Among many possible routes, I focus a bit more on the operational or operative ontology, as articulated by Bernhard Siegert, and while also putting it into conversation, for instance, with Karen Barad's onto-epistemologies, and many others, of course, over the past years of Brian Masumi, Wolfgang Ernst, and others. They develop a different aspect of operative and operational approaches. Similarly, scholars such as Aurora Höll have written on operative media extensively. But for Siegert and others and their take on operative ontologies, it already works in a particular interesting key, that of reality creating devices which have these operative powers to create what we perceive as ontologically existing states or statements or claims. Siegert's inversion of Heidegger's pairing of the ontic and ontological becomes a guide through which to look at actually existing media devices that have these powers, these ontic powers that create ontological claims, perhaps. Some of them are in Sigurt's development already and treatment, architectural, such as the usual example of doors as a basis, basic cultural techniques of insides and outsides and power. Some are geometric and design-oriented in other ways, such as the centrality of grids as interesting devices between empirical reality and the development and creation of abstractions. And here the term operative ontology is really closely related to the body of work, of course, as mentioned, of cultural techniques, where a similar position on the devices that establish foundational ontological distinctions comes to feature as their own methodological core. Think of the earlier question on, is there life on Earth? The question of life. Any ontological definition of life is actually in practice established through a media epistemic device or devices that map out the existence of this definition of life in concrete situations. Now, you could claim that the definition of life pre-exists those devices that measure life, but in this case, we could go full on with the media approach and say that any significantly meaningful approach to life, for instance, is already inherently dependent on the question of how it can be deciphered as such. What I want to claim is that there is a whole critical lineage additional to these positions of theory, and some of this can be teased out with the help of, for instance, Barad. So the onto-epistemological, and apologies for this extremely long quote, but I'll just leave it up there for a moment. So the onto-epistemological points to this material existence of epistemic devices, that they are materially involved and hence ontologically involved in reality, not just reflective of reality outside that. So Barad's wonderfully short and effective definition of onto-epistemology is useful also in qualifying the onto in the operative ontology. Knowing, in Barad's words, knowing is a material practice of engagement as part of the world in its differential becoming. So cultural techniques are defined by this intertwining of material and symbolic registers of knowing. And while Barad's take is most focused on the scientific instruments of quantum physics as onto-epistemological interventions, the notion of apparatus that is at play becomes a concept that gains a life of its own, again, in very different ways than perhaps the apparatus theory of cinema much earlier. It does this to the extent I claim that it specifies the stakes of operative ontologies as they concern also operational images as apparatuses, that operational images are these material apparatuses in the world. To quote Barad at length, and I won't read the whole quote, it's up there already, and you've probably been reading it already, I hope. It really defines many of the key features that I would sort of want to claim are really relevant to thinking about images. So think of the notion of apparatus here as one of images. Images as specific material discursive practices, images as production of differences that matter, images as dynamic reconfigurings of the world, right? So there's a lot of those notions of operative recursive involvement that images do that really, to me, puts a lot of theoretical weight at the back of the already significant concept developed by Farocchi. Now, Barad writes in the context of feminist materialism and science studies, and I would say that this helps us to understand the implications of the notion of the image in those contexts and in those terms as well, and how the question of the apparatus of the image is also something that helps to shift us to the specifics of the cultural landscape of, for example, capitalism with these tools at our disposal. This shift to think about both the theoretical and the sort of operative effectiveness of the notion of operational images as part of analysis of contemporary culture is not a million miles away at all from Farokky's concerns throughout his career and throughout his films since 1960s as well, whether they were called operational images or not. The military image was part of the bundle of his interests in instrumentalization of visuality or industrialization of visuality, as well as industrialization of thinking and thought, as well as the sort of operational procedures designed in contexts of capitalism and its institutions, from prisons to factories to shopping malls. So when I turn to operations of capitalism, I do this with the help of Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nielsen, and a hat tip to their book, Politics of Operations. The broad spectrum of operations as a conceptual device for analysis of how, in their words, capitalism hits the ground, including also how it relates to modification of territories as part of lineages of what operations, what are the operations of operation images. They select, and I sort of follow their lead, three key terms that are very perhaps specifically central to contemporary capitalism, namely finance, extractivism, and logistics, which also corresponds to many of the axes of struggles that define operations other than war of the contemporary situations, other than war, but perhaps inherently in many cases linked also to war. In all the cases, one can say images do play a role, even if they're not inherently only of the image or the visual. Software optimization would be one, the remote sensing apparatus relating to extractivism and surveys and prospecting the planetary surface would be another. And then in finance, the question of abstractions and automation are not necessarily resolved as images in the photographic sense, but as mathematical graphs, diagrams, and signs that become central drivers of speculative powers, whether in terms of particular directions of derivatives or some other mechanisms. And here a hat tip to Robert Mitchell and Norit Halpen's work recently on the smartness mandate, which I sort of see nicely historically and conceptually following up on this notion of a particular diagrammatic of mathematical production of the world through certain equations that are central to contemporary understanding of, for instance, derivatives. So what is interesting about the notion of operational images, that it doesn't speak only to images, that it becomes a generative tool, a conceptual tool, an instrument, a sort of a probing for the instances of mediation and power, of signs that are devices, of operative forces that are transformative of material environments. Here, the shift from real-time operational systems, such as different automated systems that process real-time data from the world at the back of intelligent robotics and paradigms of learning, is one. We shift also to institutional operativity, where a different time scale than real-time of technical images or technical operations comes to play a significant role in illuminating many aspects of contemporary forms of operations. At this point, I was sort of thinking of talking about contemporary forms of military imaging as part of territorial reformatting, pointing to the ways in which the central concerns of images and justice, images of war, images of violence shouldn't be neglected. And Farokky's concerns shouldn't become only a theoretical observation, but we should be aware of the contemporary military operations that even if we often think about operational images as part of the lineage of precision imaging, precision warfare, we're witnessing a massive scale of destruction of civilian infrastructures that itself speaks to this expanded notion of operations, where operations of military destruction relate to operations other than war. In other words, a whole, and I don't want to say this lightly, a reformatting of habitability of life, habitability of areas as such. So whatever Parikka also develops needs to be kept in mind as part of our contemporary analysis of violence. So the second part of what I promised a bit earlier is on a new project that expands from operational images to operational surfaces. So for several years, we've been collaborating with the Madrid-based artist and scholar Abelardo Gil Fournier. He has also worked in the operational images project. Our joint work has both tested and used some of the methodological insights perhaps inherited from Parikka, including the audiovisual essay format, in using that to elaborate questions of operational images and environmental surfaces in our case, including also using the idea of soft montage across a split screen space of an image that I've sent to students as well earlier to look at some of our work. And we have also continued this work in written format, including into a sort of an alternative history of photography and light media up on the screen that I'll speak about briefly in a moment. So in the video work, Seed Image Ground, we were commissioned by the Photo Museum Winterthur to engage with their theme strike situations a couple of years back. This brief hinted at a strong Parikka-style link to operational images and war, while we wanted to reroute this to a different mode of image aesthetics, one that concerns environmental growth and plants as objects and surfaces of imaging. In short, while the idea and the notion of a strike and the image in and through a strike resonates across Parikka's work, including the notion of phantom image, and it resonates across the contemporary landscape of military visual data and targeting complex, we have been also interested in how it turns to variety of other scales of environmental and planetary imaging. So in this vein, in Seed Image Ground, we engage with aerial vision and cultivation of land as a narrative thread around which we weaved a couple of historical and contemporary themes as well. So firstly, the themes of plant growth that is modeled as an image. And this has a particular relation to this history of science of these practices that measure by way of visualization or visualize by way of light measurement, instigating a new kind of trajectory for what we understand by way of light media. Then secondly, growth and transformation modeled or expressed in moving images. And this relates very closely to, for instance, early cinema in how it was part of this time-lapse imagery that became a central way to model and understand plant movement as well. And then thirdly, territorial management, architectural but also landscape surfaces, as images and as data. Growth and management of territories come together and which hints at how this questions of remote sensing practices are becoming the most central way of sensing and imaging in the transformation of territories, whether agricultural or other. Now, this is one version of engaging with eco-media research as well as practice, as it is one way of testing methods that comment or build on images by way of images in a recursive manner, where some of the images become or are also plant surfaces as well. It finds a broader theoretical context as well, one that is central to at least one strand of recent theoretical debates in visual culture, broadly understood. They hint at a link to Giuliano Bruno's influential work in media and art history and architecture, to consider architectural surfaces as elements of projection and media in ways that merges the two. And this provides a very interesting angle to tactility and media aesthetics, while also shifting the scale of images as representational into these surface formations. So when Bruno talks about image surfaces or surfaces as images and images as surfaces, we wanted to expand on this question from the architectural to landscape features, to consider plantations, agricultural plots, different biomes, and how these could be seen as experimental takes on media and ecology. But it's also a theme that we track as part of the history of science that we see sort of emerging gradually since late 18th century, early 19th century onwards. And it concerns a topic that is very current at the moment about planetary management, and how planetary management has become about large-scale surface patterns that feature in one way as images to be manipulated, so to speak, from deforestation to reforestation, from epistemic surfaces to aesthetic surfaces, in ways that expands much outside traditional art history as such. So in our take, living surfaces becomes one entry point to this kind of an operational surface. Surface itself as an instrument through which to manipulate and understand planetary surfaces. It's a speculative proposal that still has an empirical historical history as well. So we address how the surface of the Earth has over the past 2 centuries become known and perceived as an environment of images. In other words, the understanding that the planet is made of material surfaces of different types is linked to the production and distribution of the synthetic surface of the image, that we create images of different sorts to understand the so-called natural surfaces. This can be formed on the visual light spectra or radiating outside the visual light spectrum. They can be circulating as paper maps or as GIS data layers. They can feature as pixel-related land cover indexes, very specialist instrument of understanding surfaces of the planet, or as image datasets of contemporary environmental monitoring, which are aggregated and streamed on commercial and non-commercial data platforms. So more specifically, our argument builds on the history of observation of vegetal phenomena through also visual media such as photography, early moving images as mentioned, and recent digital technologies including remote sensing. And the historical examples implied a broader argument about ecological aesthetics and media theory. By focusing on images and imaging to understand the growth and movements of the surface of the Earth, we see how this link is both historically grounded and really fruitful as a proposal about aesthetics and scientific operations of images. In other words, this entwining develops not only into specific cases of management and environmental surfaces, but hopefully gives rise also to ecological aesthetics of media. And it's this sort of aesthetics that we see as really central to the topic of the Anthropocene as such. And it deals with really centrally about scales of imaging and different spatial and temporal scales of vegetal life, from the geode to the plant, from the agricultural plot to the laboratory situations observing growth. So in this manner, we articulate a multi-scalar cartography of living surfaces and vegetal images, which is not about images of plants as such, but plant life as it entangles with practices of light, imaging, and modeling. which helps to understand really these other sorts of questions of Anthropocene, perhaps from that sort of a nexus of media plus scientific practices. And this is not to dismiss. We want to acknowledge that there is a significant history, art history and visual history of botany, which also in many cases is a history of colonialism. There is an entire media history of photography of plants, including a photography by plants, like Harold Wager claimed in early 20th century. And there is a cinematic history of how slow motion and time lapse becomes part of the unfolding of plant growth and movement. All of this is important. And one could add that there are multiple layers to this art and media infused narrative that speaks to issues of cybernetics a bit later and data as the knowledge techniques of planetary plant surfaces. So for us, the question of what grows, how to accelerate growth, what are patterns of life, see, we're going back to questions of life, and how to sustain planetary ecological diversity are central to environmental, agricultural, and vegetal life as they entangle with planetary scale issues of climate change and biodiversity crisis. We want to present very much a media theoretical angle that really starts excavating this topic in ways that is ending up with theoretical argument as well as these historical case studies. Also in this case, we're sort of pairing it up with a video essay that is still work in progress, so I won't show it to you now. But just to mention, it's sort of presents its own video essay speculative case of an alternative genealogy of light as it enters the planet on a planetary scale and becomes investigated as part of measurement of reflection, and as such becomes part of this narrative about planetary heating, planetary temperatures by way of this massive scale of light media. So one could really call this a shift from operational images to eco-media, or operational images and eco-media, that we really want to develop it as part of this broader picture of operationality, of reshifting the coordinates of what is considered as an image and as part of the whole big picture. So very briefly to summarize, the scene at the beginning of this talk evidenced a particular operational situation that became more commonplace gradually. Remote sensing is not just detection in the simple sense of what is out there, but includes a reflection upon the operative qualities of these post-photographic practices. This sort of post-photography did not mean just digital devices or emergence after digital photography in the restricted sense, but that is very central to the ways in which we understand photography and images as data nowadays. But it's about a large-scale observation and interpretation of planetary scale patterns that already shifted the question of image to its capacities to detect beyond representational image qualities. These recursive image systems stand as one example of operational images, and even some decades before Harun Farocki's work, or before Harun Farocki coined the term, but they are a relevant example also of not just military incorporation of the mode of imaging that has fundamental relation to planetary scale sensing. So what I've been working on in Operational Images, the book, in the sense of different investigations of how the visual, the invisual, and data become enmeshed, the forthcoming book with Abelardo is directly related to questions of imaging the living surfaces of the planet. Here the surface is also approached less as a traditional image, than as patterns that can be pieced together as informationally rich or poor surfaces. Remote sensing and planetary might be an obvious example of the aerial imaging that has become a core theme of both operational images, but also Alan Sekula's instrumental image. But it is indeed prevalent in the long lineage of operations that constitute this parallel line of inquiry in media studies, and the link between media studies and lots of specialist practices beyond popular culture of images. So if there is, is there life on Earth is a question itself that is enabled by a long chain of operative techniques, of operative devices, of imaging. And as such, it becomes itself one of the many questions triggered by operational images as such. And this is where I'm going to finish and hopefully have a Q&A now. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. So we really enjoyed the Dr. Parikka's talk. So okay, so he's here now. So so let me give you a couple of questions and a comment on your talk as well as operational images before we open the floor for discussion. And so my take is based on my evaluation of the two contributions that operational images book and the ensuing work make. And the first is can be explained by citing Thomas Althusser's great so estimation of Parikka's work and his idea of operational image. So I'm going to directly quote his words. He says, "One can go even further and claim that operational images that function as instructions for action, are the new default value of all image making, against which more traditional images, i.e. images meant to merely to be contemplated, to be watched disinterestedly, or for their aesthetic qualities, are being redefined as specialized instances of operational images." So given his insight, I think the one of the key contributions that the book makes is to demonstrate how operational images, or the total operationalization of all image making, as well as our visual perception, fundamentally restructures what images are and how they work and how they can be seen and how they reformulate our subjectivity and our world. So so the first question or request regarding this point is one of the key concepts that you do not sufficiently explicate in your talk is the idea of the individuality, and which is the key concept that you develop in your book. So for the audiences who are not familiar with this, the individuality refers to a kind of element, material and technical elements, such as graphs, diagrams, or even the mathematical vectors in the case of AI-based image production that operate beyond our visibility and visual perception, but determine the image's ontologies and the ways that the images function and that images work. So so definitely one of the key implications of this concept is that operational images based on individuality challenges our conventional idea of the distinction between visibility and invisibility, while also making new distinctions, or drawing new lines between them, or the transforming the conjunction of what is visual and what is invisible. So what is visible and what is invisible in various components of our world, and the visualization of object and even human beings. So could you so this is the first things that I want to make to why the idea of invisuality is important, and what kind of implication it has in understanding our visual culture that is more and more operationalized.
Yeah, that's good. I'm very happy to talk about that a bit more, as it is featured also in the title, so it's only fair to actually focus on that as well. And as you also hint, there's a very fine threshold at which invisual and invisible become separated. So, okay, first of all, invisual is a term that I pick up from Anna Munster and Adrian Mackenzie, who speak about platform observation and the ways in which particular machine vision, but also data aggregation and this sort of observational events that happen on different digital platforms take place and also shift the register of perhaps images into something that is invisual in their terms, not of the register of visibility in perhaps quote unquote traditional terms. I'm intrigued about what they say, and I pick up on that, both in relation to contemporary forms of AI imaging, a bit more on that in a second, but also in relation to this broader regime that we've been discussing in media studies and beyond as well, in various design and digital culture studies contexts, on the question of visibility and data. And it sort of seems to link to that quite inherently. But I'm interested in this concept and in the book in general of how it shifts and becomes itself a perhaps operational concept to think of data or these forms of imaging that have at their core not just catering something to become visible, but production of a different mode of sensibility or of knowing that is and is not part of the visual regime. That's why the invisual is such a fun term to play with. So on the one hand, one could see that it relates to the question of spectrum of radiation, right? And this is a point that I make in the book as well, is that what if most of our art history, media studies, visual studies, most of our focus in the humanities and social sciences and across the board has been on visible light? And what if the next challenge is to think about beyond the visible light? Well, that's already part of the whole drill that I'm interested in. And it's not a million miles away from how invisibility was discussed, both in history of media and cinema and photography, and history of scientific imaging, and which has sort of built up to almost this epistemic discourse around how to make the invisible visible. So that's why I planted in the book as well a couple of images that are sort of like classical examples of what it meant in early forms of technical imaging. So for instance, microphotography or microscopic photography, and in general microscopic seeing would be one of like this regime of visibility that was opened by technical images. So fair enough, it's built on this, and there's a fair bit of discourse also in photography around this, like Peter Geimer's work. So this is interesting. But then the question of individuality would perhaps emphasize even more so that it's not a question of the things that are not just at the moment visual becoming visual, like that we shed light on them or other metaphoric ways, but that there's a regime of knowledge that is being produced that might take place through images, but it's actually, for instance, indeed datafied. So hence I kind of end up in these questions of measurement and other things, but also in the context of AI images, I'm sort of interested, and I do a lot of mostly summarizing of really brilliant work by others on how the displacement of the notion of the visible image or the visual image becomes rehearsed in AI image discourse and pipelines, basically. So the points that I make in, can't remember, is it chapter 2 or 3, probably 2, it seems that in this context of AI images and machine vision, or computer vision actually more tightly, images are being displaced into being training data sets and models and platforms. So everything around the image that it mobilizes becomes the beef. Whereas this also sort of necessitates, in the manner that Mackenzie and Munster do as well, to think about what would be the scope of a concept like images in this situation that has to include data. But we, of course, you and me and many of us here are interested still is what does it mean to the image as such. So it's this sort of a bit of a movement with the notion of individuality that then becomes about the contemporary moment, but also I'm sort of attempting to use it as sort of back reading as well into certain moments. And hence, I mean, we can talk later about this, but photogrammetry would be an interesting example, whether that would be a case of individual images as well, because it does the work of operationalized modes of measurement, where the image is itself central to this operation of measurement, but it's not reducible to what is becoming seen or visual in the image, if you know, in these terms.
Thank you. The second and last question that I want to make is another key contribution of the operational images is also what I'm definitely been sympathized with, which means that what is key in understanding our contemporary culture and the reformulation of our world in the context of in the context of new technologies, observation and the management is not just about the ontology of images, operational images. What is more important is the total operationalization or mathematization of everything beyond everything with and beyond images. So that's also related to what I'm doing in the context of the key implications of generative AI. But the broadly my broader interest is rising, expanding the idea of operation itself across different practices and different disciplines. So basically, I think that the idea of operation is not simply technological or governmental or other kind of thing, but also aesthetic and conceptual, actually, because based on what I learned from Sandro Mejadras and Brett Nielsen's the politics of operations, what is key in their concept is not just the internal heterogeneity of the operations, but also the ways in which operations connect different things that are perceived as distinct or separated. So such in the case of extraction and particularly logistics. So the key implication of the concept of operation is the ways that they connect everything, different things in ways that that one system expand, augment, or renew their effect, each effect in ways that incorporate that are affected by other things than itself. So so such as the cinematic and non-cinematic, and relinking the relationship between nature and the human being. So the second question is related to this this issue that I'm grappling with is probably in the latter part of operational images and as well as your upcoming book, Living Surfaces, you primarily focus on the operations of images onto, planetary observation and measurement and territorial and infrastructure, restructuring of the Earth. But my question is, how about the operation, not only the operationalized surface, but also the operationalized subjectivity or the human being now that is more and whose perception consciousness is more and more operationalized in many senses. So what I have in mind are two lines of thought. The first of all, there is a kind of the tradition of the critical, theory or the critical media studies that consider operation as a kind of key technique for the shaping a kind of subjectivity that is more friendly to neoliberalized, governmentality or the kinds of the control of human subjectivity and consciousness. I'm thinking of Maurizio Lazzarato's idea of machinic enslavement and Bernard Stiegler's take of algorithmic culture as as a technique for people's the proletarialization of human consciousness. And the second, but on the other hand, there is another interesting insight made by the role of the human being that in relation to the technical operation of image production and the image ecology. I'm thinking of William Prussia's insight into the importance of the envisioner in the production and perception of technical images, and also the importance of trained observer that Peter Garrison and Lorraine Deston highlighted in their monumental work Objectivity, where they highlight the importance of trained observer in producing knowledge that we can that knowledge made by the new mechanical technologies for observations such as telescope and astro photography. So there is, I think this is another way of thinking about the relationship between subjectivity and operationalization of everything. So I'm wondering what do you think about the issue of subjectivity or human being in in the context of the contemporary situation where everything seems to be operationalized.
Yeah, that's really great. You planted really good points already in the question that I sort of want to pick up on as well, but I'll pick up on also what you mentioned earlier, because it might be a key to what you're thinking and what we're thinking and what is interesting here. The Thomas Elferser quote already had a nice seed of an answer for this as well, when Thomas was writing about operational images in relation to instructions for action. And the notion of instructions, well, both instructions and action, is great because it implies the multiple levels at which the instructions might be in action. In other words, it might imply the idea that, okay, this is clearly about algorithmic executability of software cultures and algorithmic cultures, fine. That's where we often have read operational images, but also that the instructions for action is a theme that goes way back in media history as well, into this sort of a regime of drilling and training that does a sort of a cameo feature in the book as well. That's been more developed in different strands of media theory, not least Friedrich Kittler, and the idea that media are anyway about the modes of training of how to perceive in them as well. So the idea then becomes, and as per your question as well, that these instructions for action can be also institutions. So institutions as the true algorithmic large-scale quote-unquote machines in which instructions and drilling take place. So I'm interested exactly in these questions where it's not just the image that seems to be automated, right? Often most of our discussion in this has been about automation of images, which itself is super interesting, but also the idea that in which ways have particular kinds of images played a role as part of the automation that is the institution. So early photography, but also even pre-photographic practices like colonial practices around drawing that I sort of a hint at really briefly, and others have, of course, as we know, done extensive work on, is really interesting, and where the instructions comes into play as part of training for particular modes of capacity to draw for whatever purpose. For instance, colonial expeditions that are drawing botanic plants to be sent back to Europe, all kinds of examples. So I think there's something of an inkling about this mode of automation that comes back to drills and training as part of the question of subjectivity. And the other one is that what you mentioned by way of Lazzaratos and others as well, that what would be then the sort of on the one hand, internalization of these models of subjectivity that relate to the big picture that Mezzadra and Nielsen and others are thinking about by way of finance, logistics, and whatnot. So that's one. But on the other hand as well, the mode of thinking about subjectivity as already always externalized. So the things that colleagues in cultural techniques literature have been doing as well, that most of the things that we think of as subjectivity and cognitive at the back of post-structuralism and whatnot has always been about externalities and the ways in which that governance of language, memory, the usual stuff that is at the center of our subjectivity, especially to us in media, cinema, and whatnot, is already out there as well. So there's a particular format of thinking about the subjectivity that already at the core of it is about these interiorizations, externalizations. And now what is probably specific about this is extractivism. At least that's the picture. Often we've been, I see the relevance of this, because then it would be about the modes of extraction from the subjectivity as well as part of the whole broader operationalization and valorization through, again, platforms or some other forms of either cinematic or digital forms of extractivism that are at play. One more thing about this. So what's interesting then is that this very specific notion, perhaps this is the most interesting for us to think about subjectivity, but also that how it links then to this mode that seems to be mostly echoing particular post-structuralists' points made into more critical political economy like Lazzarato does, but how it also perhaps builds on certain lineage of operations research. So basically this not really visual mode of knowledge and management theory that emerges gradually since World War II, that I would claim is one backbone to understand operational images. And what's interesting about operations research, we can again talk later if we want, but is that obviously it's often talked about in that very nexus of media and military, and because of its born in the midst of Second World War and just years before that, but how it grows into management theory. So the ways in which it becomes integrated into this quote-unquote scientification of management is really interesting from the point of view of this big picture of capitalism and what is implied in terms of perhaps subjectivity in that capitalism. And again, to come back to the point that, of course, this is really interestingly picked up by Lazzarato, for instance. So I value the point you made about this link.
Thank you. So let us open the floor for the audience's, the questions and comments. So so you can, turn on your video and make your comments or questions, or the input your own on the chat box on the right side of your interface. So
yeah, it's absolutely fine also in chat as well. It might be sometimes easier to formulate, so we're happy in either way. And there's something while people are thinking of questions, I think what intrigues me about the notion of operations, or again, that it's, in my take, it's obviously about visual culture and in visual culture and media culture and whatnot, all of that. But the notion of operationality itself is an interestingly multi-scalar notion. And that's why these questions like you asked about subjectivity and its entanglement on multiple scales of issues, it becomes quite a good conceptual, at least engine of sorts.
Even I'm thinking of expanding the idea of operation, not only beyond the kind of scientific or management or or sort of kind of things. So in order to see the broader logics that are applied to different productions of moving image across for different aims and different effects. So that's definitely the idea of operation can be applied to how one filmmaker deploys the camera position, the camera technique. So we are very used to the ideal camera operator. So also the ideal operation is key to understanding the changing the aspects of cinematography, mise-en-scène, or even montage. So that's one of the directions that I've been pursuing in my future work.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. Exactly. That is good to point out that there's this very specific history of the notion of the operator as well that comes into play in contemporary forms. And it's an interesting contrast with notions of users or producers that they think in terms of operators, and the sort of which most often was this very hazy gray administrative term, or operators like telegraph operators, earlier times, but it has a value in more cybernetic and digital and contemporary cinematic cultures indeed.
Right.
And indeed your topic of generative AI as well is very much there.
Yeah. So any question or comment from any of you? Yeah.
No worries if not.
Okay. Right. Yeah, I can see
all right, Sang-Young.
Yeah.
I have a question. Thank you for your really inspiring talk. I learned a lot. And I'm really interested in your notion of planetary plant surfaces and the fact that you draw inspiration from Julian and Bruno's concept of surface. And as you're interested in the plant growth and movement and the technology to record it temporally, I assume that kinds of planetary surfaces would include like biological fluctuations or kind of vital fluidity that changes over time, which I think could be a big difference from like architectural surfaces or texture surfaces on clothes or screen that Bruno originally theorized. So could you elaborate more on your conceptualization on these kind of new ecological surfaces in relation to Bruno's original thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's exactly true that it's on the one hand, and I'm very appreciative of Juliana's work, but it's true that we go into this sort of a lineage that is again a weird sort of not your traditional cinema historical or media historical theme, but still very much implies an epistemology that is technical images because of the role of photography as cinema and early on in making sense of plant movement and plant growth. So basically, we sort of see it as a particular kind of a history of modes of environmental management and large-scale surfaces that are at the centrally about how we manage and mismanage contemporary forms of the climate change and its multiple other parallel forms like biodiversity crisis, and it becomes partly something that people in early cinema history and sort of history of science have done a lot. So there's sort of a link between moving images and movement of plants becomes very much a sort of a already established theme. And there's really great work on this as well, and also emerging in the coming times as well. There's new work coming out on that, and we wanted to sort of build on that a bit more to look at exactly these dynamic patterns and the ways in which the dynamism of those living surfaces. We sort of early on we talked about them as vegetal surfaces, but we sort of wanted to include this slightly larger term of dynamic or living surfaces in those terms, that the mode of the dynamism of living surfaces of different kinds, and we have a very tight case studies across 200 years, become not just reflected in particular media technological frameworks, but they give rise to particular mediations because of their own logic of dynamism. So they almost like, we're almost implying there, almost is sort of a like, perhaps the word that I'm going to use here, that it's that there are models of mediation in those dynamic living surfaces. So we have case studies from like plants and early atmospheric research or research into atmospheric gases. We have case studies on biosphere thinking, so basically the backbone of what then becomes known as Gaia theory and whatnot over the past decades, and its role as particular understanding of the planet itself as this sort of a living surface of its own kind that has to do with atmospheric, but also this thin layer of growth that defines the planetary surface and then picks up by Bruno Latour as critical zones. And of course, the scientific work on critical zones. So there's multiple legacies here as well. But one case that is sort of comes back in a couple of forms is also agriculture. And there's a lot more to be done on there as well, that the modes of regulation and mediation that relate to agriculture as particular technological form of cultivation, obviously, which often has been talked about in relation to two poles when in history of science, and less in media studies because it just has been mostly ignored, except with a couple of exceptions that are emerging. And there's a new issue of New Media and Society on farm media, so it sort of relates, broadly speaking, to this area. So the two poles were, of course, mechanization of agriculture that Siegfried Gideon in architecture theory briefly mentioned, and then the green revolution of chemicalization of processes of growth, which itself, of course, backs to 19th century. So you've got all kinds of mix of things happening in, if one reads media and media theory through agriculture. You got chemicalization, you got industrialization, and then you got these all kinds of forms that we also claim are visual media. The idea that, quite in literal terms as well, the observational capacities of understanding, again, so-called green surfaces across different practices becomes itself in this expanded sense of visual media. And there's a lot of that we don't deal, but I'm super curious about and we'll try to do more on. For instance, practices of remote sensing and false color imaging, super technical, like, I mean, in terms of, specialist practices of land cover indexes, for instance, through which health of a crop is being color coded. And this is very blunt, I mean, simple way of putting it. But these forms of epistemology, indeed, that are somewhat in that ballpark of what can be read through Bruno, but actually they expand to these very different scales in those terms, as you mentioned, and with the core of it being living surfaces in the literal sense of growth and vegetal surfaces, which is mostly what we deal with, but it implies exactly this question of like, what forms of dynamisms are being framed in a literal frame as well. And that becomes an interesting theme for all kinds of questions of, again, visuality and computation as well. And I think that sort of story there is about computation. And one more thing, you might ask now, and any healthy critic would ask, like, again, isn't this a total inflation of the notion of media, that everything becomes media? But perhaps we're not even trying to push this necessarily into a bracket of media so much as we're doing this cultural history of a particular stretch of thinking about living surfaces that deals with scientific and technological forms of framing that also in some cases overlap with media like photography, like cinema, and also in very recent terms with digital imaging and remote sensing. So that's sort of a slightly long answer as well, but of course there would be much more, but I think that's really, and again, there's a lot of interesting work happening in media arts and such that deals exactly with this question of what specific forms of mediation is at play.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Yeah, thank you for your great conversation. Actually, it's the idea of atmospheric media and the relationship between atmosphere and media is another one of the key, the topics that we are very interested in. So as a possible topic for, next semester's, curriculum right now. So definitely I'm thinking of, Juliana Bruno's, new book, Atmospheres of Projection, or, Yuriko Kurota's, crime acting media. And
exactly, Yuriko's book was at the back of my head as well, and would give a nice context for this discussion because of its link to geoengineering and this sort of really subtle way of expanding of geoengineering, not just being about some whimsical geoengineering in the sort of a technical sense, but into this whole epistemology of thinking about scales of planetary mediation and through whether it's media arts projects or something else.
Okay, other question or comment?
Great. Okay, we can also finish here. I know it's quite late. This one, Sean. No more.
Yeah, just one more. If there is anyone who has
That's John.
kind of query or thinking, but
let's have one
help
more,
us
John.
say something.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Chanyeong, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for this eye-opening talk. So this is pretty much very generic question, but I was wondering how your conception of operational image speak to the very traditional definition of documentary as creative recreation of what we call actuality. Because I mean, throughout your recent monograph, you constantly distinguish operational image from the ontology of digital image, and the way I understand it is that operational image, unlike digital image, it's kind of has become a central condition for perceiving the reality, whereas digital image, when paired with documentary, it was more of a exhibition of the reality in which what we call reality can be manipulated anytime. But this time, operational image seems to be indeed like the condition to understand the reality in a certain sense. So I was wondering, when paired with this notion of documentary, I wonder, your notion of operational image rather speaks to more traditional documentaries craving for the real, or is it I don't know, strengthening like digital documentaries, the exhibition of the reality as something that's always prone to, manipulations and modifications?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. And I don't have a good answer to that, but it's interesting to start thinking this from the point of view of even literally Farocki here as well, whose many films and video works could be classified in certain ways as particular documentary styled framings of operational images. So there's something interesting about the fact that, of course, most of the images we have of operational images are within so-called, and I'm using this very hesitantly, but documentary style traditional modes of delivery. So Harun's work on military imaging and training complex or therapy complex in serious games and many other forms, let alone his earlier films as well, somehow implied this tension between the mode of legacy of documentary and then the new kind of an image that was emerging. So Harun also wrote this really, and I quote this really badly, but like 10 or 11 rules for filmmakers as well. And one of the rules there was this really wonderful, that if there is a new image, if there's a new class of images in the world, you have to show it. In other words, that cinema and film or video, and perhaps in some cases, but broadly speaking, these moving image practices are also themselves about this mapping of emergence of new classes of images, right? So the recursive function of the documentary style itself can be an excellent tool in mapping it. It doesn't really resolve the sort of ontological question that you were after, but it's exactly this sort of almost like a meta level thing that we're constantly aware of as well. And that's why I keep on using the word recursive or recursion, that is embedded in images are these kinds of different kinds of images that are barely visible, in some case, perhaps not visible at all. And I find the methodological question that is given by documentary as an investigation, artist-led or practice-led investigation, a really good entry point to this, as part of like that sort of a like ontological quest of like indeed mapping of, okay, how can we show that particular kind of imaging practices, and hence often it becomes a practice of proxies. In other words, these stand-ins, these en lieu, or indeed proxies. So that's an interesting theme that I sort of was trying to mention in the book as well, but not sufficiently. And of course, others have written about proxies a lot, and the proxy aesthetics of it is one thing. And then the operational aesthetic, as I outline in the book, is another one as well. Of would there be an operational aesthetic in the sense that, again, coming from cinema and some other literature history as well, that showing something in operation itself becomes an interesting theme for an aesthetic, right? The idea of a procedure and procedurality that can be framed. So there's something there definitely in how you point out as well. So I value the question, even if on a sort of a like I'm not sure, it wasn't a genre question, but still in that sort of a like a question of ontologies, I'm not able to resolve it better than what I just said. Thank you for the question. It was very apt.
Thank you very much.
All right, so it's time to wrap up, and I'm very happy to to finish this year's years and this semester's the Kollokium series with great many the very rich, brilliant talk followed by the rich conversations that are still definitely will be ongoing. And so during the next the winter break, so we'll set up next semester's line of speakers, and probably it will be announced in during next March. So please stay tuned on my social media and other other platforms or other means of circulation that you can find the information about what our next speakers will be. So thank you for your attention, and please give a big hand to Dr. Jussi Parikka. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was very, very much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, let's keep in touch. And
yes,
so
we will.
yeah,
have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.